Um, Thank you, everybody, for tuning in again. I have with me this time my friend Candy, and we're actually just going to have a conversation. I have an idea about what we're going to talk about, but when friends get together, as you know, things can go a little lopsided. So um, we're just going to start having a conversation. And if you have anything you'd like to input, we welcome your input, although we can't really see you right now. You see us. But, do what you do. Put your comments in the comment section and I'll holler back at you. Thank you. It's okay. So, Candy, what do you want to talk about?
Well, I just have to say thank you for this because I've never been interviewed before in my life.
And you're not now, so sorry, sorry,
But it
sorry.
kind of feels like more official than, our 4 and 5 hour conversations we have.
Shh, don't scare the people. Don't scare the people.
Yeah,
Okay. They're
yeah.
like, oh, I don't have time for 5 hours. No.
Um, what do I want to talk about? We talked about a little talking about grief.
Yeah, we did. I said, Katie and I were talking recently about grief. I don't remember every single word, but I remember I said, grief comes in all shapes, sizes, colors, um, situations, and circumstances. And of course, grief is probably an even bigger subject now. Not that it's always not a huge subject, but because of the pandemic, everything is just going to revert back to 2020, just everything. Um, but for me, I've had losses that have nothing to do with the pandemic at all. There's a certain loss you feel when you're an empty nester, of which I am. Um, and let me pinpoint something Candy and I briefly spoke about just a second. Um, I don't know what day it is, but the other day, and I know what day it was. It was Mother's Day, and Candy texted me and she said, which I thought was really weird. She texted me and said, "How are you today?" Really?
That's what my dad and that's our secret. Like, how are you really? Because there's the answer that we give.
Fine.
There,
I'm good.
there's
How are
the
you?
accepted answer, and then a lot of times there's the real answer, and a lot of times we don't know that we're living in the expected answer until somebody says, "How are you really?"
And that's exactly what I responded. I said I didn't know. I told her how I was really doing. It's Mother's Day. And what nobody else knows, because I haven't told anyone until this second, so you guys get to be the first, is most of you know that I have a college age kid. And my daughter's off at school living her life. And I thought to myself, self, she's going to come home and surprise you for Mother's Day. And she didn't. And I was disappointed, not crushed, but of course, disappointed. Um, she called and we talked for 4 or 5 hours.
Okay, okay,
That's
good.
just something I do. Don't call Tanya if you're not ready for a conversation. Okay. So we talked for 4 or 5 hours. But Katie,
I do have to say though, just little insert there. The conversations with Tanya are not fluff. I mean, they're real conversations. So
Candy, you're scaring the people
no,
again.
I'm really not. I'm just telling on you.
Anyway, early in the morning, Candy texted me and she asked me, how am I doing really? And I had not been completely aware that I was feeling angst and disappointment. And when she texted me, it brought it all up to the surface. And I wrote it in my journal and responded to Candy that I really needed somebody to say it to. I really needed to say I'm disappointed, that my heart hurts because my daughter's not here. On top of that, later that evening, speaking of loss, I realized that maybe, just maybe, not that my feelings on motherhood and stuff like that are invalid, but maybe it has something to do with I don't have a companion in my life to share life events with.
Mm.
And I immediately turned to the person I've always turned to because she was always here. And that's my daughter. And now it's her time to find, her social space, her independence and life activities without her mom, which is absolutely valid, celebrated, supported, and she better. But also I had to recognize to my Heavenly Father, this is a place I needed to cry out to him as a place of loss,
Mm.
as a place of bereavement. Um, because I feel the loss.
Mm.
And I don't every day recognize it as that. But yeah, that's what happened.
My friend Betsy used to talk about, um, I don't know why, but she used to talk about things in terms of buckets. You have a love bucket, you have a hug bucket, you also have a grief bucket.
Mm.
And when you live with grief, because honestly, if you love deeply, you're going to grieve.
Mm. Oh, girl, I'm gonna write that down. If you,
Okay.
I'm gonna write that down. Go ahead, keep going.
Um, if you love deeply, you're going to grieve. And the trick is not to run away from the grief. But there's also the times when your grief bucket overflows. And when those emotions, because I'm not sure grief is an emotion. I think sadness is the
State?
emotion.
You think it's the state in which you're
Yeah, I think it's a state of
posture?
existence or
Mhm.
being. But so there's a lot of emotions that go with grief. There's anger, there's sadness, there's
A
yeah,
bit of
depression's not really an emotion either. Um, Heaviness, you feel
mm,
I mean,
weighted.
it's not just a mental assent. There's also the emotions that you feel, which affects your body, which affects how your brain is going, which affects your emotions. It's just a thing. And grief is grief is sneaky. I
Mm.
will tell you that. Yeah. You can't, like, you don't wake up and go, okay, today I'm grieving. You wake up and you're like, I am in turmoil. Why? Seriously. And um, there are days when so the grief doesn't go away. It's always there. There are days when I think I manage it better. There are days I totally forget about it. It's still there. That was a nice tone.
Mom,
Oh, okay. Um, so should I tell some of my story? Because I feel like, not that I have a corner on grief, because I don't. I feel like,
are you standing alone on the corner?
no, I think what I'm doing is I'm aware. I'm aware of grief, more aware of grief, because once I realized 30 years ago, once I realized that everything I was struggling with came back to grief, I started
Mhm.
studying it. I started seeking the truth about it, I think.
Well, I haven't. That was probably from knowing you and being able to talk things through. The and the Holy Spirit, he's just right on target. Ah, he's always listening in on your private mental conversations. And so when you texted me, he brought that up. And I think I was at a point to mentally handle the conversation. And I think we all have to be at a point where the Holy Spirit can do more than just rub our back, because sometimes it's just a rub your back kind of day. I don't want to talk about it. I just want to sit here, moan, eat my popcorn, and watch Lifetime movies. Okay, just keep rubbing my back. And other times he's like, okay, we need to have a conversation.
Well, but if you think about it, even like when Tati was little and she fell and hurt her knees, or she fell and cried,
Hit
what's
her
the
head
first
on the concrete. Yeah.
what's the first thing you did?
I went to go pick her up.
Did you tell her about running, or you shouldn't have done that? That's not the first thing you do. The first thing you do,
No, that comes like weeks later because
oh,
I don't want her to be scared then to run. And
right,
then, yeah, I don't want her to be afraid of. There's comforting first.
right. So comforting, and then there's also the Lord just sits with us.
Mm,
He
that's
just sits with
good.
us because he doesn't cause the things, but we live in a broken world, and we are affected by the choices the people we love make. And there's not a way to shield our hearts from that if we're going to love them. I know, but it's the truth. And so there's a choice we have. We can either, and really, there's not really a choice. If we belong to the Lord, he's not going to let us stay all buttoned up and arm's length and no thank
That's
you.
not, well, number one, that's not love. So,
Right. And that's also not how Jesus lived. And so the whole point is being more and more like Jesus. So,
so if you have a story to share, and things you learned, because I learned nothing from my story.
okay. I don't think you're finished learning from your story,
Oh
or
man.
God would have said the end and you'd be in glory, right?
Oh, okay. 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 There's nothing wrong with glory. Walk on the streets of gold, sit
No, there's
in a
nothing.
mansion that he built for me by the side of the seashore. I'm going
But
down.
that's volume 2 of your story.
Yeah.
As long as you're living volume 1, you're going to be learning from your story.
Some of those lessons, girl, I'm telling you.
No, but the Lord doesn't waste anything. He doesn't waste one single tear, um, one single uh, fist punch in the drywall. Um,
Okay. Now there's a story.
no, it wasn't me, so I can't really tell it. Um, but that was how my husband used to deal with his grief. Uh, yeah, and you're going to edit this part out, right? Um, yeah.
We all have those hole in the wall stories. I actually have one, and it wasn't me. Believe it or not, it was the little one. So yeah,
I
see,
do believe it, but we can talk off the record about those stories.
yeah, grief. We got to go back to grief, but that was a pinpoint in God doesn't waste anything because there are lessons we learn, even if they're not right away. Um,
And sometimes it's a pattern that we
mm,
have to do a long time before then you look back and go, oh, and then you see it. And that's kind of what happened with me. So I have one sister, I have one sibling, and we grew up. She's 2.5 years younger than I am. We grew up the best of friends. We had all the same friends. Um, in fact, and we both grew up in a Christian home. My dad was music minister. We were at church every time the doors were open because he had the key. So we opened the church and then we closed the church when everybody had left. And, it was early 70s, so we didn't have two cars. We were all together most of the time. Um, and so when she got out of high school, there's a whole, stuff in the middle there, but she decided she wanted to go to school in North Carolina. So she moved to North Carolina to get residency. So it would be cheaper. And I went with her as her roommate. Um, I don't know why, because I wanted to get out of my house.
because your sisters and your best friend.
Yeah. Um, And
And she was
there
going to be
was,
living on her own and not with her parents.
well, and it's not like, I mean, mom and dad weren't like spying on her through me, but we were both raised knowing what was right and wrong. And she'd already been living there for about 6 months when I moved up there.
Mm.
And then we got an apartment together. I brought the dog. So Scruffy. So it was Candy and Sarah and Scruffy sharing an apartment in Charlotte, North Carolina.
All right now.
And she started working at a restaurant where she met this guy. Now, she had dated other people and I'd met them and stuff. And I dated people and like I said, we had all the same friends. But this guy didn't want to meet me. He would never come to the apartment. She was always with him. Then she started not coming home at night and not calling. See, it's like, I just want to know where you are. Are you by the road dead somewhere? I just want to know where you are. And so my first experience with my mom's voice coming out of my mouth was with my little sister.
All right. That's how you know you're grown. You're mature. And something you said reminds you of what your parents said. And then you have to look in the mirror and go, Mom here?
Yeah. So long story, really long, complicated story short. This guy ended up, she got pregnant, was gonna try to hide it from me because I had a summer job lined up, so I was gonna move out. 2 months after she found out, I'm like, what were you thinking? Like, it's just not coming home. Okay. And so there was a lot of things. I can truly say I thought I knew how life worked.
Mm.
Um, I was 22 years old. I knew, and I thought I knew the Bible. I thought I had all the answers for
I think
everything.
that's what if you look it up in Wikipedia, that's what 20 somethings mean.
Yeah.
I know everything. Everything. Yeah.
But then my sister got pregnant and was gonna not tell mom and dad. And I couldn't keep that kind of secret. I wouldn't keep that kind of secret. And so through a whole bunch of angst, it ended up mom and dad came up and helped me bring Sarah home to Florida. And that year that she was pregnant, she lived in a home for unwed mothers because of finances. My dad made too much money, even though he didn't make much money, for her to qualify if she lived in his house. So
government assistance, so you have to show.
Yeah, and it was a Catholic home, which we were raised Southern Baptist. So that was kind of different. But that was like those people full of love, full of Jesus. Literally God's answer for so many things that we didn't know how we were going to do. And she's still not married to this guy. He's living in North Carolina. She's living in Florida. He was not a good guy. Turns out he was not a good guy. And she ended up having the baby. They got married. They lived in Fort Walton for about a year. And then one day they were gone.
Gone.
They just left.
So they got married, which means he left North Carolina, got a job in Florida, or moved to Florida.
No, he never got a job in Florida because he thought, well,
they weren't going to stay long. He probably had that already in mind.
Well, no, he had the he shouldn't have to work.
Gotcha. But he moved and they were there for about a year in Florida.
Yeah, they
in the same part of Florida where your parents live?
in the house with my parents and me.
That's the same part. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So they were there,
But
and
that was before they got married. He came, see, he waited to see if the baby was a boy or a girl, and the baby was a boy. So then he left North Carolina.
came.
That's what he told me. I'm not hearsaying.
So he came for his son, and but he stayed for a minute, and then you said they moved.
We didn't know where they were though. Like they just left in the middle of the night. They took the baby and left. So that's when things were like, uh, what? And there were times before that when it was just chaos in my house, chaos. And at the time, I was working two jobs because I never had just one job. What is that when people are like, I guess it's when you're young, you can do stuff.
You're 20 something. You have a ball of energy and you don't want to be bored. And
I also,
money
I also had a car payment.
Yeah, I was gonna say money and a car actually means more about independence and options. You get to go to the store when you want to. You don't have to wait till mom or dad comes back from wherever they went, church service, whatever. So yeah, working that yeah.
So I look back, just like right this minute, looking back, I think I had so much anger, but I really think it was the trauma. It was trauma. This guy was an abuser. He literally pushed my mom and me physically around. Um, my dad was working night shift, so when my dad went to work at 5 o'clock, Aziz came out and he thought he was head of the house and was smoking in my mom and dad's house. I mean, just breaking all the rules that all the mom and dad rules
All
that
the mom and dad, all the households who had mom and dad rules. And but it did he do it in front of your dad too?
Mm-mm.
That's interesting. That's extremely interesting.
Well, yeah. Um, and dad finally told them either move out or get married because you're not going to sleep together in my house anymore. And that's kind of when things started getting super intense. And I remember there was one night when dad was at work. My mom stayed in the bedroom. She never went out to the rest of the house because Aziz. And I got so mad. I remember running into my bedroom, slamming the door, and talking to God out loud. That's not something I did back then. I've gotten a lot better at it. But I remember saying to him, God, what is going on? What do you want me to do? How do I deal with this? And he said, love them. Just love them. And I said, no, what you're asking is too hard. It's too hard. No, you can't really expect me to do that.
Wait, you can't really expect me to do that. No, I'm not doing that. Mm-hmm. Get him, Candi.
And I closed my heart to the Lord.
A decision, or you felt obligated? Not obligated. That's the wrong word. Pushed is in my head. Like you were
Well,
being
not
forced.
pushed, more of a, if that's what he's wanting me to do, I'm going to do something else because it just,
And what did that look like for you? The closing part. I mean, what does that mean to you?
um, well, about the same time as when my dad told them either get married or move out. So they went to the courthouse and got married. And Monday, March 13th, instead of Friday the 13th, it was Monday the 13th. That's how I remember it because it was like just, and Let me just say, anybody who thinks marriage makes things everything better, wrong. Wrong.
Okay, I'm gonna have to write this stuff down.
Okay, so we're talking about grief. I think my anger with the Lord was grief. I really do.
And what were you grieving?
My sister's choices in men, for one. Um,
But okay, I have to stop right there because we're women. We don't jump out of the dating box and go, I have dated all perfectly wonderful men, godly, honoring men, and I just don't know who to choose from. So there
she
must have been.
she would date. She wanted to rescue him. He was in the country on a work visa, actually a school visa, and I don't think he ever took one class, but he worked in North Carolina. Once he got to Florida, he never worked, and Sarah did. Sarah worked. She had a baby. Um, she was working two jobs. Yeah. Anyway, all that to say, there was bitterness building in my heart, which I think that's what grief turns into if you don't let the Lord have it.
And the anger as well.
Yeah.
Did you think you were grieving not just her choices, but grieving on her behalf?
No, I was grieving her.
Okay.
I was grieving the relationship with her since that time. That was in 1988. And since that time, working with the Lord, letting God heal my heart, I can look back now and grieve on her behalf. Um, it has progressed so far since that. That was like the beginning. They disappeared. They ended up in North Carolina, and then they disappeared and ended up in Seattle, Washington. Um, and the only time Sarah called is when she was pregnant again. So this has been so long ago. My husband has never actually met my sister. But I thank God for Michael because he has his own trauma and his own grief that helps him relate a little bit. And God has restored his siblings to him in the past 3 years.
And what does that mean to you? That if I know about it, you know a lot more about it. So what is seeing that, being on the front lines of a process of restoration and healing? Like I said, a process.
Yeah, absolutely the Lord, though. Absolutely, because of the circumstances. Their dad had to die for them to go, okay, enough is enough. We're blood related. Let's be together. And they have a group chat that text that they keep up with each other. There's a Dungeons and Dragons game every Saturday night that several of them participate in that Michael is dungeon master for. And all the brothers went up to Pittsburgh where the youngest brother lives. And they're all half brothers and half sisters. So it gets kind of crazy, kind of tricky.
That sounds really cool though.
It is because the Lord, just because the Lord. And
but
the Lord laid out opportunities and they said yes. See, he laid out an opportunity in front of me and I said no.
That was a long time ago.
Well, and in that span of 30 something years, I've had a baby, a very special baby who has, we should be 21 in June. And I have contact with all of my nieces and nephews that are still alive. I have a relationship, not just social media, with the older three. They call me Aunt Candi. They call my mom and dad Grandma and Grandpa. They send private messages. They ask for advice. I mean, and that, as long as Sarah and Aziz were together and they had the kids, there was no contact allowed from mom and dad and me. What happened is when they were in Seattle, Sarah had had 5 children, and we think the second youngest one at the time, there might have been some delays or some emotional. He needed more. He needed more, so he cried a lot.
Mm.
And I don't know. I don't know. I don't think I've ever told you this, Tanya. And if you want to edit it out, if it's too intense, I get it.
There's nothing too intense for Tanya.
Well, but it might be too intense for people watching. So,
grief is not politically correct, right?
nope.
Take your time. Maybe.
Well, this is the beginning. This is the beginning of the Sarah book. I've already written it, just so you know. So one Monday, I think it was Mondays. Um, my aunt knocked on the door. I went and answered it. So Aunt Jeannie's at the door and Aunt Sherry's right behind her, which for the two of them to show up at the same time
Means
in
something
the same
happened.
space.
Means something happened.
And so they went in and, where's your mom and dad? And I was like, So they sat in the living room with my mom and dad and told them that one of Sarah's babies had died. The way they found out, and this will just tell you, the way they found out is my Aunt Sherry's ex-husband, Steve. These are the two people who love each other, just can't live together. So they were married, divorced, really good friends, in each other's weddings. Just,
Hey, these days you just.
yeah. He lived in Seattle, and he saw on the local 6 o'clock news that a man had been charged for killing his toddler. And when they gave the name, then they showed my sister in the courtroom. So Steve called Sherry called Jeannie, and they all showed up to tell mom and dad.
Now that's a God thing.
That's all they knew. That's all they had was, the only information we had was from, I haven't told this story in a long time, was from the news report. And Uncle Steve actually had recorded it on VCR, on VHS.
Way back.
Yeah. So I got up and left the room, and I went into the kitchen, got on the phone. I called King County Jail in Washington State, trying to figure out what's going on, where things are. And the county jail wouldn't give me information, but they gave me the name of the investigating officer, who was a detective. And she called me right back and said, we knew Sarah had to have a family. We just didn't know where to start looking. So 2 days later, my Aunt Sherry and I got on a plane and flew to Seattle. And the detectives met us at the airport. And I promise you, it was Cagney and Lacey in the flesh. One was tall and blonde and beautiful. The other was short and black hair and just stocky. And
how lovely is that? How lovely is that?
They were carrying guns in the airport because it was way long ago.
Seattle police ladies.
And so they took us to the hotel, and the next day we went into, and they interviewed me. They took my statement. It took 6 hours because they wanted the history. Because they knew nothing about Sarah except what they saw.
Did they find Sarah? I mean, do they know where she is?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Aziz was in jail, but she was in the apartment. And Sherry went with me. Sherry and Steve both went with me to find my sister. To see
And you hadn't seen her in 7 years, something like that. She had 5 kids. I'm assuming.
it had been about 5 years
Yeah. So
since I'd talked to her or seen her.
does you had already started the grieving process because of her relationship with her husband and all that meant and the separation of her with the nucleus of your family, things that you both grew up being so familiar with. So how does this make you feel now? I mean, the circumstances are unbelievable, kind of. I mean, it's traumatic, but you can't really believe this is what's going on.
Can you say
But,
TV movie of the week?
well, there's Cagney and Lacey, so okay. We already have Cagney and Lacey, but at the end of that, after the marathon conversation in the police station, you're getting ready to see your sister.
No, I didn't.
I mean,
I didn't know. We had an address and it turned out to be the wrong apartment number, and neighbors told us where the right apartment was. So it was this huge apartment complex. And meeting the neighbors to, just because I was just desperate. So I was asking strangers, do you know Aziz and Sarah Safwan? Um, and everybody did. Everybody did, and not for good reasons. So it was like every experience, every step I took in those 10 days, more of what I thought life was degraded and chipped away. And I remember, after, I don't really want to talk about it now because it doesn't really have to do with what it does, but I don't want to talk about seeing her because I haven't processed that. I know it was ages ago, but
why don't we fast forward to life in the present? You had a
well,
separation with your sibling.
life in the present, there's been huge moments when the Lord said, all right, let's be real about this. So my sister was gone to me. When I did end up seeing her, she was not who she was not her. She had a foreign accent. She couldn't remember how to say English words. I mean, it was classic battered woman syndrome thing. But it was my Sarah. Um, and I have my journal from back then when in the room I was staying in, said, God, what do you want me to do? I can put everything down. This was 1994, the year before Michael and I got married. We'd have been dating for 4 years. This was October before we got married the next August. And I actually said to the Lord, I was actually willing to drop my whole life and stay in Seattle to try to rescue Sarah, to try to be there for her kids. The social worker took us, Aunt Sherry and me, to see the older 4 kids. And Musa remembered me. My oldest nephew remembered me. I used to rock him to sleep. He would laugh himself to sleep. It was the most precious thing. So in the grief of not having my sister, there was also the grief of not having nephews and nieces.
You said when you just spoke, you said you told the Lord you were, or at least in your heart, you were willing to drop everything.
Well, I asked him if
And,
that's what he wanted me to do.
but you also said to rescue her.
I was the big sister. My whole life is take care of your little sister. Take care of your sister. Watch out for your sister. That's what we do as big
So,
sisters.
so in that, between the time you last saw her, when her and Aziz left mom and dad's house, and at the point where you're getting reacquainted with the nieces and nephews, in that in between time, was there also guilt because you weren't being the big sister?
That didn't
And
end.
whatever your definition was.
The guilt did not end until I don't think I even recognized it until Michael and I got married and moved to Chicago. And once I wasn't in my mom and dad's home and I wasn't holding them up in the middle of all of it,
Then you had to look at you.
that's when the grief storms happened. That's when the PTSD happened. That's when I'd be cooking in our little bitty kitchen with the screen door open, well, the door open behind me, and I would see out of the corner of my eye somebody outside the screen door. Nobody was there, but that happened over and over and over. So the fear, the things that I had to set aside so that I could hold my family together. Well, once I'm married and in grad school, working my own job, living in my own house, 12 hours away from my parents, all the stuff.
And that's a really good point, that you can grieve something. There's a point where the grief starts, obviously, with an event of some kind. And there's that immediacy of recognizing the loss and all that sadness and anger and stuff that's immediate. But then, of course, most of us don't crawl up into a ball for the next 20 years. We get up and we move on.
We don't have a choice. Like,
But when we first started this conversation, it occurred to me as you were talking that there's not an end to grieving. There's more of the psalmist walking through the valley of the shadow of death, because the shadow of grief is still with you. It's not on you as heavily as when the loss first takes place, of whatever kind that is. But you always are walking with some kind of sense of it. And then sometimes, like you said, you're now married, it's now several months later, almost a year, and you're getting on with your life, so to speak, like adults do. And then waves of it overcome you.
Yep. Nightmares.
Wow. Okay. But
Yeah. And so that time when I was in Seattle and I asked the Lord, do you want me to stay? Because I'll, if that's what you want, I'll do it. And I did one of those, open my Bible, close my eye, and put my finger somewhere. And it was literally, I mean, it was somewhere in the Old Testament, but it was literally one of those times when God tells the prophets, let Israel do what she's going to do, because she's headed for destruction. But if you stay with her, you're going to end up destroyed. So you follow me, basically. And I was like, okay, I'm going home.
you were there's a part of you that was relieved that you didn't have to hold this up and make it work or whatever.
There was also a part of me that was like so grateful to have God's actual word. So it wasn't really, I mean, yes, it was my choice, but it was a huge one. And he was so gracious to say, because he knows what's coming. I don't.
I really like that part, that you went to him, all this stuff is happening, and you say, what do you want me to do? And here's what I'm willing to do, whatever it is you say. And I think it's important to point out that, as with everything, whether you agree with the answer or not, it's important to follow.
Yes.
Not because he knows what's coming,
Yes.
And sometimes it's right around the corner, not years later. It's right there.
I just realized I didn't tell you why I went out. I told you the baby I told you the baby died.
Yeah, you did. I remember. I remember. But
But
you told me about Aziz. You told me about that.
uh, okay, cuz he's the one who killed the baby.
Yes, yes. You told me that, but you didn't tell me previously that you went out there to rescue.
Yeah, so that's the big grief that I live with because my sister's still gone. My sister's still gone and I've tried to call her, try to convince her to come home. I've tried to write her letters and actually mailed them. I actually, when I was my last year of college, I wrote a piece of music for my senior project that I named Sarah and I sent her that piece of music. Um, my dad and I both, every once in a while, I'll Google her name. I'll Google Aziz's name to see. Because right now it's just like this status quo of it feels like nothing. But in that time, God's done a lot of stuff in my heart. And like I said, I started researching and trying to learn about grief. Um, I started asking the Holy Spirit um, how to deal with grief. I actually read a book called Ambiguous Loss
Ooh.
um, several years ago. It's by, you remember that John Travolta movie, The Boy in the Bubble?
Yes,
Boy in the Plastic. It was written by the actual person's sister,
the actual boy, the boy.
right?
Oh, the boy in the bubble's sister.
Yes.
Got you.
As she lived on the fringes of
Of his whole life,
his whole
his whole life.
tragedy. Um, and she's become, I'm pretty sure she's become like a counselor, psychologist kind of person. But she did what I was doing. She researched grief. Um, and ambiguous loss is that sense we have of people being gone. I mean, even though it's like you and I talked about before, grieving the living. Her brother wasn't dead, but she couldn't have a relationship with him except through the plastic. Um, and while that's like, yay, she can have a relationship with him, she can't hug him. And I don't believe he lived beyond young adulthood.
No, well, not in the movie. In the movie, he did die.
Yeah,
I think maybe before he was 20.
yeah. And so, and he was her big brother.
Mm.
So there were so many things that she missed out on, and that feeling, that grief, that loss. Um, just it was really good to think about grief in a different way because we think about, okay, they're grieving because somebody died and then they buried them and now they just have to get over it, and that is not how it works. It's not how it works.
And I don't think it works that way. I think when we grieve the loss of life, whatever it is, um, there's a finality to the event. But when you said the words, although I think we're all acquainted with some type of it, grieving the living, you have to live with the fact that this won't have the, or might not have the restorative nature you would normally hope for when everybody's still breathing air, you know. Um,
Right.
yeah, and that's
But at the same time, speaking of breathing air, um, I have long believed that if you are still walking around on the planet and still breathing, God's not finished.
he's not.
Do I see how my relationship with my sister could ever be restored? No, I don't. I sometimes imagine, hold on, go ahead, finish. She's washing her hands. um, I sometimes imagine, getting a phone call from her or going to the door and there she stands, and how will I react? And I honestly don't know. I know that every phone call I've had from her, the few, like, it will literally go 3, 4, 5. It's been 7 years since I've talked to her on the phone. Um, and after I got off the phone with her, I was a mess. I was a mess for like a week. I just wept all the time. Um, but out of that last conversation, I called mom and dad because they're really the only two other people that get
That's
it.
what it's like. Yes. Oh, here's a question.
Wait, I don't want to lose my thought.
Oh, gotcha.
So the last conversation I had with my sister on the phone, and I got off the phone, I was literally like heaving, weeping, sobbing. And I called my mom and dad, um, and talking to my mom on the phone because my dad got to the point where he just his chest
Good.
started hurting, so he hung up. Um, and before I knew it, my mom was literally praying out loud for me, praying all the things. Um, she That's not something that happens very often. And I remember getting down on my knees on the floor because I was so overwhelmed with God's mercy. Because my mom was praying for me as I was trying to navigate how to be in Sarah's life, but not in Sarah's life. And so there's so many things I grieve. I grieve her. I grieve my relationship with her. I grieve being a sister.
Mm, that's good.
I
Yeah.
grieve being an aunt. Even though I have relationships with them, it's all virtual. Um, I grieve getting to watch them grow up. Uh, she is a professing Muslim now, and so I grieve that relationship she had with Jesus. And we can never really be assured of someone else's salvation just by the way we
Of
see
course.
them looking. But I remember in high school being so concerned for my mom and my sister's salvation, and then the three of us sitting in the hallway at like 2 a.m. and them telling me of their relationship with Christ and how they've asked Jesus in their heart and reassuring me. And that's what I cling to, her profession of faith from her own mouth. So when I pray for her, I don't pray like she's someone who's lost for eternity. I pray for someone who has lost her way. And I pray for someone who's never going to. Jesus said, no one can snatch us out of his hand, and we can't walk out of his hand. He said, Paul said, no created thing can ever separate us from the love of God. So I'm banking on that and praying that God would bring her home to him. Honestly, it will be devastating. My mom and dad are in their late late years. It will be devastating if things are not resolved or restored and one or both of them dies. Um, but I know God doesn't. He doesn't do the whole earth is it. You know.
And he doesn't really like boxes.
No. Oh, let's talk about boxes.
And might I say, I did say grief comes in all shapes, sizes, and events. I think God does too. And the way he works in our lives comes in all shapes, sizes, circumstances, and events. Vis-a-vis the conversation, the snippet of information about Michael's family. I don't think the children dreamt that far or would have thought that that feeling of closeness with their siblings would be like it is because. And the because was, their dad died. And that's a hard situation to navigate, the death of a parent, regardless of how old you are. And so to find restoration because of it.
Well, let me tell you how God did that in 3 sentences or less. So none of the siblings had a good relationship with their dad.
Meaning Michael's siblings.
Michael's siblings. They had 3 different moms, so 3 different sets of siblings. And he was on his 4th wife. So, and it turned out none of them really liked him. And they didn't know that. They didn't know that he had treated all of them the same, because it had been one of those, well, we're the first family, so
we don't talk to the second or third family.
Yeah.
They're not the real family.
Well, it hadn't really come from the kids. It was
I'm assuming that, yeah.
Yeah.
I should probably
but that's how they had grown up. So as you get to adults, you still have those childhood things, the opinions and perceptions. And at the funeral, my husband stood up and did the whole eulogy thing and said, his first line was, "So my father would never have won Father of the Year award." And then he told the truth in a very respectful, matter of fact, Dad might not have da 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 da, but look at the legacy he's left in us. And that was the way it was like everything went.
So the truth actually set them all free.
Yes. The truth that wasn't very pretty, but, and I know, they don't know, but I know Michael was on his knees before God for the 3 days before that. Like, Lord, what am I going to say? What do you want me to say? Because of how he felt.
Of course. And you want to protect
versus
your family.
Well, versus wanted to respect, his dad's memory and not offend. But yeah. And the way God has worked in our family and my sister's situation. So they took all the kids into foster care, and every child she had after that, they took straight out of the hospital nursery into foster care, because they wouldn't meet the court's rulings over and over and over and over and over. So 7 kids, 3 different families, 3 different Muslim families. However, the Muslim families were not, they were like, okay, the adoptive mom that took the older 4 kids was raised Catholic. So the kids did Christmas and Ramadan. They did Easter. They did Easter, like real Easter. And so with all the Muslim holidays, they also did all the Christian holidays. And my oldest nephew, who I used to rock to sleep and sing Jesus Loves Me over him, started dating this Lutheran girl in middle school, and they ended up getting married, and he knows Jesus. In fact, all of his siblings that were at his wedding, Hannah's dad is a Lutheran pastor and married them, and they had a prayer. They prayed at the altar, at their wedding altar. So all the siblings are standing around because they were in the wedding party, and Musa and Hannah are talking to Jesus. Just saying, right? And And my dad and I were talking about that just a few weeks ago, and he was like, I said, it's just amazing how God restored our relationship with those kids, even though Sarah's choices seemingly would have gotten in the way of that. And my dad said, yeah. And boy, he didn't do it like we expected, did he? I said, no.
That is absolutely the truth, and a good place to end, because we identify hope, and we identify that hope doesn't look like, when God orchestrates it, doesn't look like we expect it to, but it's still hope, and there's still legacy, and there's still all those things that in our hearts we hope and long for. Although getting there sometimes takes the scenic route, and the scenes aren't always that good or groovy. And just to point out, especially to our audience who probably already know this, God gives us the hope and the strength to withstand, the hope for a future. Sometimes He even lets us see and experience restoration. But in that, we still grieve.
Well, and the restoration doesn't look like our expectations.
Absolutely not.
And the hope doesn't look like our expectations.
No.
But He is about rescuing, redeeming, and restoring all of our hearts. And there is no way we can hold in our brain even like our own hearts, much less
exactly
all these other hearts. But I will say, and quote me on this, remind me I said this.
I'm gonna write it down.
Loving my sister is worth it, is worth all of the grief. Because in the grief, God has shown me visions of Himself that I would have never seen or experienced if I had stayed in that place I was in high school, where I knew all the answers and I knew how all the scriptures were supposed to look. I've gotten more of Jesus walking this grief path than I would have without.
I love that part. I've gotten more of Jesus through the grief than maybe I otherwise would have.
Because with the grief, He gives us hope, but the hope is not, okay, things are going to work out. The hope is not, things are going to be better. Yeah, but the hope He gives us is Himself.
And that's what we need, is more of Himself. And a little bit less of how we think that should work out. Not to say our expectations are wrong in any way, but to have those expectations and then lay them at His feet and letting Him work that process out. And for anybody who's watching right now, whatever day it is, whatever year it is, whatever time it is, if you desire to have Christ walk with you through your grief, you can actually have that. If you're already one of the King's kids, one of God's precious, then call out to Him, cry out to Him. Believe me, He already hears you. You can just make it more verbal. And if you're not in the family of Christ, He is calling out to you. He is tapping on the door of your heart. He's not creating waves of grief just so you can run to Him, but He is standing at the door of your grief, waiting for you to open it so He can come in and not just sup with you, but comfort you and walk through the grief with you. The grief and the relief and the hope comes through Him. And by the way, so does the restoration. So give me a shout in the comments. We'll link up, talk a little bit more about it. I appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, Candi, for sharing your heart and your story.
Well, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.